I'm Laura Pereira, and together with my colleague Jakob, I will be presenting a few examples to support the application of CCS, renewable energy production, and an energy storage project. As Maria mentioned, these are based on questions sent via the help desk, which allowed us to understand the challenges you are actually facing. If you could skip the slide. This will be a very short presentation, so we have skipped some of the slides, but you will be receiving a full version that you can refer to when you need. Next slide, please. I know Maria has gone through the application process with you, but I just want to know the importance of having a solid understanding of these first 3 steps. If you have clarity on the classification of your project, the rest will be much easier. So when it's not black and white, the sector in which your project falls, do spend some time understanding the options, or submit your question via help desk, and we are here to help. I will skip the recap of the methodologies, but the overall concept is that the absolute emissions avoided will be equal to the emissions in the reference scenario minus the emission in the project scenario. Though in some cases, project emissions can be disregarded in this first phase. Next slide, please. And one more, please. So let's say you want to build a special transport system to enable transportation of CO2 from an industrial complex to a reservoir. This will fall under the CCS category, where the reference scenario will be the CO2 being emitted if capture wouldn't have occurred. The calculation of the GHG avoided is quite straightforward, so I won't spend time explaining. What I want to highlight in this example is that the applicant will have to secure a buyer for the technology to secure the accountability over the claimed GHG avoided, which will be the basis for its reimbursement, even if they are technically responsible for just one step over this value chain. So this doesn't mean that you need necessarily to submit a joint application with the buyer of your technology. It's up to you how you wish to organize the division of liabilities and revenues. So this is what I wanted to, these are the most common questions coming regarding CCS. Next slide, please. However, if the CO2 that you intend to capture and store comes from a biogenic origin, then the calculation will change. This because CO2 originated from combustion of biomass or biofuel is deemed neutral, and therefore it's already excluded from the ETS. Therefore, for the Innovation Fund, these projects will be considered hybrid projects, where you first have the GHG avoided by the use of the biomass instead of a fossil fuel in the industry, energy-intensive industry, for instance, and later you will have the GHG avoided by the capture project. So for the calculations, you have to combine both energy-intensive industry and CCS equations whilst removing any double counting. Same logic applies if your project is a hybrid renewable and a CCS. So for instance, a bio CHP plant that after you will capture this CO2 and store. So this you should combine the equations. Note that such projects are valued and do receive extra points under the degree of innovation criteria in the second phase. So again, these are the overall questions related to biogenic CCS projects, but if we haven't responded to your question, do send to us. Next slide, please. Then shifting to renewables, the example we want to bring is a common one where heat will be generated using biogenic residues and will feed into an industry currently using heat from a coal-fired CHP plant. And any leftover will be sold as a district heating. So the question here we receive often is, shall I use the most conservative emission factor between the coal and the fuel used in district heating, or a blend of these 2 emission factors to estimate my reference emissions? The answer is neither. This because, to simplify the methodology, the reference scenario for renewable heating project has been preset as being natural gas boiler and with already preset efficiency. So whichever is the actual reference scenario, for now, you will have to use the standard emission factor provided in the guidance, even if this leads to a lower reduction than you would have achieved under the actual circumstances. But again, as Maria noted at the beginning, we do welcome the actual information from the origin of your fuel for knowledge sharing purposes. Next slide, please. So now we'll hand over to Jakob, who will present some of the rest of the slides and questions.
Thanks, Laura. This is Jakob Wachsmuth from Fraunhofer ISI speaking. I hope you can all hear me well. So with regard to the methodology for energy storage projects, let me first recall that for energy storage, the reference scenario is the situation without the planned storage plant in place. And then the greenhouse gas emission avoidance is given by the fossil energy use avoided due to the inclusion of the storage plant, minus the emissions caused by the provision of the stored energy. So on this slide, we provide you already with an example, which is a hybrid case of providing RES energy and combining it with an electricity storage. So, for example, it could be a floating PV plant that is combined with innovative electricity storage to provide controllable RES generation. And in this case, you have to combine the methodologies for renewable energies and for energy storage, so sections 4 and 5 of Annex C. So, yeah, and in particular, you need to avoid double counting. So in the equations, you see that we have included here the terms for RES production and also for storage, but then you have two reference cases. One would be the production of electricity based on the 2030 mix from RES, and the other one would be the production of electricity from the storage unit, where the reference case is the electricity supplied by a natural gas turbine, so peaking power. So which one to include here? Not both can stay. This would be double counting. In this case, as the generation becomes controllable, it will be the reference emissions from the electricity storage methodology that is used, because by including the storage, you kind of improve on the renewable electricity produced. So given this, you have to use the emission factor for natural gas turbines as the reference case, and assuming that no auxiliary services are provided by the energy storage unit, and also taking into account the assumption that electricity use or also electricity stored has an emission factor of 0, all other terms vanished, and so the emission avoidance is just given by the RES energy produced multiplied with the emission factor for natural gas turbines. Next slide, please. So now we come to two examples on the methodology for production facilities, as we have seen in the questions coming to the help desk, that this is a case that is particularly relevant to several applicants. And so we will have one example on renewable energy production facilities and one on energy storage. In both cases, the emission avoidance is calculated based on the use of the technologies, not based on the production process. So not based on the manufacturing of the plant or the manufacturing process in the plant. So for the example shown here, the production of innovative blades for wind turbines, the emission avoidance is then based on the amount of RES-E generated, as in the case of a RES plant, but depending on how your wind plant will, or how your blade will be used in a wind plant. So please be aware here that this is that on the contrary, for the calculation of relevant costs, you will have to refer to the production facility and not to the use of the blades. And again, there are two other important prerequisites here. On the one hand, you will need to provide a provisional agreement with the buyer of the technology that you produce already during the first stage. So to make sure that what you are producing will really be used in the end. And on the other hand, you also have to explain in detail the rationale for the expected performance. So also including other components of the wind plant in this example that may be required for the production of renewable electricity. And then, as I said, the greenhouse gas emission avoidance is given by the electricity produced from the wind plants multiplied with the emission factor, which is now coming from a renewable electricity methodology. So it is the 2030 mix. Next slide, please. So we now come to a production facility for energy storage components. A particular example here is that the project foresees the production of innovative batteries to be used in electric vehicles, which should replace long-distance cars with an internal combustion engine. And so the methodology to be used here is the one for energy storage from Section 5 of Annex C. But again, you have to consider the particular requirements for production facilities. So in this case, what you look at is the number of batteries that you plan to install or that you plan to produce and that are to be installed in electric vehicles. And the avoidance is then given by this number of batteries times the energy provided by the battery times the emission factor, which is in this case coming from the reference case, which is the diesel-fueled internal combustion engines. So different than, as we have a use in transport here, we have a different reference emission factor than before for electricity storage. Again, all other terms vanish here, and so this is the full absolute emission avoidance calculated here. But again, you need to fulfill the additional requirements, so to provide evidence that indeed these batteries will be installed in e-vehicles, and also consider provide a rationale for the reference case. And in this case, we also have some provisions for the consideration of cars, in particular to use the average travel distance of 14,300 kilometers per year. Next slide, please. So these were the examples for storage and production facilities. We now come to some frequently asked questions, which we have summarized and aggregated here. So first of all, there are several questions related to whether a project can take place in countries other than the EU. And this is not the case. The projects need to be implemented in a EU member state or Norway or Iceland. But you can use in your project feedstock that is produced outside the EU. And also it is fine if the project proponent is a non-EU legal entity, as long as the projects take place in the EU. Then we see a lot of questions also about the emission factor for electricity that shall be used in the calculations. I think we have heard a lot of explanations on this already. So be aware that in the different sectors, you have to use different factors for the feed-in of electricity, whether it's energy-intensive industries or renewables, then it's the 2030 mix. But for energy storage, the comparator is the production from natural gas turbines, while for the use of electricity, the emission factor is always 0. For CCS, this is not relevant. So next slide, please. Here you see several other frequently asked questions. Some focus on the question whether you can take part in several applications and also whether the same technology can appear in several applications. And this is generally the case, but you need to ensure that you have the financial, technical, and organizational capacity to implement all the projects if these would all be chosen under the Innovation Fund. And then there's the question on templates going to be made available for business plans, implementation plans, and feasibility studies. And here there are no templates available, but the application form B provides some specific questions that can guide you to the production of this document. And finally, Please note that for production facilities other than RES components and energy storage units, you will need to specify or make sure that you fulfill certain specific requirements with respect to the use of low carbon energy and feedstocks. That's all from my side. So I hand over back to you, Maria, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Laura and Jakob. Very clear presentation again. We have received quite a few questions for CCS and some for renewables and energy storage. So Melina will pick some of those and ask you.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, I'll start with the questions on CCS. For example, would you include the emissions associated with the plant from which the CO2 is captured in the emissions calculations for the purpose of defining a principal product, even when the plant itself will not be rebuilt or in any other sense modified within the scope of the project?
No, for the calculation of the savings from a CCS project, you need just the amount of CO2 that's captured from the capture installation, which is the industry that you will capture the project from, and transferred to the transportation system. So you don't need necessarily, if the rest of the emissions that are not captured or the production emissions from the ETS facility shall not be included in the calculation. I think that answers your question.
Thank you. Another one on CCS. For a multi-site industrial project, how shall transport emissions be accounted? And then there are a few more which are asking regarding an energy-intensive plant that proposes a CCS solution and uses a third party for the transport and final geological storage of the captured CO2, are the operational CO2 emissions from the transport and storage operated by the third party required to be included in the first stage application?
Yes. So in both cases, whether they come from different industrial facilities or just one, the transport emissions should be accounted for. And then how you would do this, it depends. Basically, what we don't want to create is to create a situation where then to allow for the injection and storage, you emit significant amount of you burn a significant amount of fuel during transportation, whether this is in trucks or in marine vessels. So that's why the transportation emission shall be accounted for in both first and second stage. And how do you do this is basically well, you have the distance between the capturing point and injection point, whether you will have different coming from different places, you should calculate this separately and then add them up. So ideally, you would have, this is one question we received through help desk as well. Ideally, you would have leg by leg, and so that you can track the distance, how many times you travel that distance, and the volume of CO2 carried in each of these legs, and then calculate the total for the year. But of course, we understand that having this amount of information is quite complicated. So we would accept as a proxy the total for the year. So the total amount kilometers traveled and the total amount of CO2 transported through the legs. So of course you lose in accuracy when you do this way, but we would accept as a proxy for now. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Just to mention that, in fact, your answer is valid also for another distributed industrial project. I mean, the transport emissions would need to be accounted for. Is this correct, Adrian? If you are on the line.
Sorry, could you? Yeah, I am indeed. I was reading the questions on Slido. Could you just repeat
Well,
No,
I
you
was
wanted to
just
say,
referring, because the question is not entirely clear. We understood it as a question for CCS, but I'm just thinking that if it is a distributed industrial project, then the transport emissions, which are, well, generated by the transport of whatever is transported between one site and the other, would need also to be accounted for. Is this correct or not?
I think so. I mean, it's not an upstream emission, so I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So just what Laura was saying is valid actually for such types of projects. This is what I wanted to say, and yeah, that's enough on this question.
Yes, thank you. Maybe one last on CCS. Can you please illustrate how to calculate greenhouse gas emission avoidance for a CCS project involving only transport and storage?
Well, and again, I think we mentioned that the example we presented was exactly this situation where the company only wants to intend to build a transport system that will enable that the storage. So if you only have the industry providing the transport system, you wouldn't be able to secure that capture would happen. So in this way, we want to make sure because the disbursement is tied to the savings, you will need to ensure that you actually have a provisional contract agreement with a buyer of your technology to ensure, because you will be accountable for, that's what will be required to monitor throughout the 10 years. So that's why we need to secure, even if you're only responsible for transport and storage, you will have to secure the buyer for your technology. But you don't have necessarily to submit an application with this industry, because this is up to you how you want to split this liabilities and revenues.
Thank you. One more, which is a bit on CCS, a bit on categorization. Please provide more information on the categorization of CCS projects full chain that capture CO2 from a source that does not fall into energy-intensive industries.
So, for instance, if you have biogenic CCS, well, this will be, for instance, a production of renewable electricity and heat coming from biogenic residues. Then these would fall into it would be a hybrid project, and you would have to combine the methodology for renewables and the methodology for CCS. So, but of course, you can only be credited, you can only count the savings of the CO2 being neutral only once. So when you calculate, you make sure that the double counting and double benefiting will be removed.
But in terms of categorization, then this project will have to fall under CO2 transport and storage if the CO2 is coming outside the EU ETS, right?
Yes.
Okay, now moving a little bit with few questions on energy storage. Is it possible to calculate the emissions of a smart grid project relating the increase of hosting capacity to the opportunity to connect more renewable plants? If yes, is it necessary to use some other kind of conversion factors? Consider that it would be an indirect way to reduce CO2 emissions.
Jakub, can you please take this one?
So in general, the smart grid projects will be eligible under energy storage. And I need to digest this question a bit more to understand what is happening here. Let me say that in rare cases, when it is really fully clear that the conversion factor needs to be different, then if you provide suitable evidence, then you can replace the factor, but this is really only an exception. And I think in this case, it would be best if you come back to us at the help desk to make sure that we have a common understanding. I'm sorry that I cannot provide more explanation here by
Yeah,
now.
I think we need indeed a bit more detail to provide a proper answer, but we generally provide a very long list of conversion factors, so we encourage to the extent possible indeed of the use of those factors rather than coming up with own ones. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, another question, again on energy storage, hopefully a bit clearer. In the previous Q&A, manufacturing of batteries components was acknowledged as eligible. However, can you be more precise about the scenario supported? What is the reference scenario for computing the greenhouse gas emissions saved? Is it linked to the applications? Can you provide an example?
Yes, this one is much clearer. Should I take it, Maria? Or?
Yes, yes, please. I think you actually explained it already during your presentation, but a short, brief answer would be, good.
Exactly. So in the case we presented before, the example that was the production of batteries for the use in electric vehicles, and then the emission reduction would be the one coming from having electric vehicles replacing fossil-fueled cars. So it comes from the use of the technology and not from the production. If the electricity storage unit would be used in the electricity system, then it would be, the greenhouse gas emission avoidance would be the one from the use in the system again and not from the production.
Thank you. A linked one. Voila. In case of manufacturing on-board energy storage solutions for electric vehicles, how should the greenhouse gas reduction methodology account for the fact that actual installation and sales of the product are managed by another party and the absolute amount of sales?
Well, maybe this is rather for us. The applicant will have to show at the application, well, at the very least, the letters of intent, where these batteries would be used, or onboard energy storage solutions. And then during operational phase, the real contracts will have to be shown, and documents which show indeed the sale of those products, that these products are in use. Having in mind that these are indeed not in the hands of the applicant, but still we need to know where the products will be used. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe last one on energy storage. For seasonal heat storage used to provide district heating, which reference scenario should be used? Regular heat storage, natural gas turbine, or other? Should the same scenario be used for the greenhouse gas emission avoidance calculation and the calculation of relevant costs?
Jakub, could
Yes,
you?
I can take.
Yeah, could you take, please, at least the first part?
Yes. So I see that maybe this question is coming from that there was a slide in the very beginning where there was natural gas turbines coming up for energy storage in general, but this is actually not the case. And natural gas turbines are only used for electricity storage. For heat storage, the reference scenario depends on whether there is a clear heat used, that is where the heat is replaced, where there's a particular fossil energy carrier used that is replaced, then this would be the reference case. Or if it is a general production of district heating, as is said here, then it would be the heat benchmark from the ETS that is used, as is also stated in section 5 of Annex C. And Maria, you want to take the second one?
Well, the relevant cost, I mean, generally the reference scenarios are good to be the same, but of course there are differences, and I just want to perhaps say that we will have a specific webinar on the methodology to calculate relevant costs, so we will be explaining all possible situations and giving a lot of examples, so I'd prefer not to give a more detailed answer here.
Thank you. Maybe one question on renewables, and then we can move on to the next agenda item. What is the proper sector to choose for an ocean energy renewable facility developed to power a desalination plant on the coast? It's renewable / sector classification. But.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question because indeed we don't have desalination plants there as like so production of clean water as an option. So such a project has to be entered under renewable energy on ocean energy in particular sector. Yeah.
Thank you. And since sector classification questions always come up, one more which is on the limit between CCS and energy-intensive industries. In which sector does a full change CCS project fall that captures emissions from two different sectors, cement and steel?
Well, this is an excellent example of where we give actually freedom to the applicant to choose where they can enter. They can enter in cement, steel, or even in CCS, CO2 transport and storage. So it's up to them to decide the sector.
Thank you. With this, I think we have exhausted this part, and maybe we move to the general presentation by the colleagues from INEA on other questions.